Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the rivers run as wild as the men who dare to cross them, and a single act of mercy can change the course of a life. Pull up a log and warm your hands by the fire, because tonight's story is one of desperation, survival, and a love forged in the crucible of the unforgiving West. It begins, as many tales do, with a man at the end of his rope, and a woman who refused to let him go. The Gila River was a beast. In the spring, fed by the melting snows of the high country, it shed its sluggish, meandering nature and became a churning, mud-brown artery of pure force. It tore at the canyon walls, ripped ancient cottonwoods from its banks, and carried a slurry of rock and timber in its greedy, icy embrace. To fall into the Gila in high flood was not to drown in water, but to be beaten to death by the world it was carrying away. It was a liquid graveyard, and Caleb Thorne was its newest resident. He didn't remember the fall. He remembered the blast, the cannon roar of a shotgun that felt like a mule's kick to his side, throwing him from the saddle. He remembered the splintering crack of the cliff edge giving way beneath him and a moment of dizzying, weightless suspension between the sky and the water. Then, the cold. It was a shock so profound it stole his breath and reset his soul. It was a cold that didn't just seep into his skin, but into his bones, his very marrow. A predatory cold that sought to extinguish the flickering flame of his life. The current seized him, a giant, invisible hand that tumbled him end over end. His head struck a submerged rock, and the world exploded in a silent flash of white light. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, consciousness returned in ragged, agonizing bursts. Gunsmoke and pine needles. The screaming of a man he'd once called a friend. The metallic taste of his own blood in his mouth. The weight of the water, a lead blanket pressing him down into the suffocating dark. His life, all 23 years of it, didn't so much flash before his eyes as it mocked him in fleeting, cruel vignettes. The hopeful face of his mother, waving from the porch of a farm he could never return to. The sneer of Marcus Flint, the leader of the Black Creek Raiders, as he'd laid out the plan to rob the stagecoach. It's easy money, Caleb. No one gets hurt. Flint had always been a liar. The face of the young guard on the stagecoach, no older than Caleb himself, his eyes wide with terror just before Flint's bullet had taken him. That was the moment Caleb had made his choice. That was the moment he turned his own gun on his so-called partners. That was the moment his life as a simple drifter had ended, and his life as a hunted man had begun. A very short life, it seemed. He fought, a primal, thoughtless instinct. His limbs, heavy as stone, thrashed against the torrent. His lungs burned, screaming for air he could not have. His side was a nexus of white-hot agony where the shotgun pellets had torn through his leather coat and into his flesh. The current was stronger. It was always stronger. It slammed him against a half-submerged log, and the impact drove the last of the air from his body in a gurgling rush. His vision began to tunnel, the frantic, churning world fading to a pinpoint of gray light. This is it, then, he thought, a strange sense of calm descending upon him. This is where the trail ends. He stopped fighting. He let the river take him. He was so tired. Let the cold have him. Let the silence come. He was sinking, the weight of his gun belt, his waterlogged boots, and his own broken body pulling him to the river's stony bed. The pinpoint of light was almost gone. And then, a hand. It wasn't a soft, gentle hand. It was impossible. A dream. A final, desperate hallucination before the end. But the grip was real. It arrested his descent. It pulled. With a strength that defied belief, the hand hauled him upwards. His head broke the surface, and he took a great, ragged, shuddering gasp of air that was more water than oxygen. He choked, coughed, his body convulsing. Through a watery, blurred vision, he saw a face. It was a woman. Her face was framed by a cascade of straight, jet-black hair, plastered to her skin by the river's spray. Her features were striking, carved from the very canyons around them, with high cheekbones and a strong, determined jaw. Her eyes, dark and deep as the river's own shadowed pools, were narrowed in concentration and fierce effort. She was Apache. There was no mistaking the intricate beadwork on her deerskin tunic or the unyielding spirit in her gaze. She was braced against a large boulder at the river's edge, one arm buried to the elbow in the churning water, holding him fast, the other arm anchored to a root system snaking from the bank. The muscles in her arms and shoulders were taut with strain. She was not merely standing against the river, She was fighting it. And, impossibly, she was winning. "Hold on," she commanded, her voice low and clear, cutting through the river's roar. Caleb had no strength to hold on. He was dead weight, a sack of broken bones and misery. He could only watch as she leveraged her position, planting her feet, her whole body a study in defiant strength. She pulled, inch by agonizing inch, dragging him from the main current and into the slightly calmer eddy behind the rock. Her breath came in sharp, controlled hisses. She was a force of nature in her own right, a creature of the rock and the river, and she would not be denied her prize. Finally, she hauled his upper body onto the muddy bank. He lay there, half in the water, half out, spitting up river water and blood, shivering so violently his teeth chattered like castanets. He was alive, but only just. He had been spit out of his own grave. The woman did not rest. She clambered onto the bank beside him and, with a grunt of effort, grabbed him under the arms and dragged him the rest of the way out of the water. He was a tall man, and not slightly built, but she moved him with a grim, practiced determination. She rolled him onto his side, pressing on his back until more water gushed from his mouth. He tried to speak, to form a word of thanks, but all that came out was a hoarse, rattling whisper. His vision swam. The world was a blur of brown mud, green pines, and the woman's face looming over him. She touched his side, and her fingers came away dark with his blood. Her expression remained unreadable, a mask of focused intensity. "You are not dying here," she said, the words as much a vow as a statement. He felt her strong arms lifting his head, felt the strange, brief comfort of being held. He looked into her dark, fathomless eyes, searching for a reason, for some explanation for this impossible mercy. He found no answers there, only a strength that humbled him. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into a black, dreamless void was her face, a visage of wild, savage grace. The river had tried to claim him, but the woman of the river had claimed him first. Consciousness returned not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow, creeping tide of sensation. The first thing Caleb became aware of was warmth. It was a gentle, pervasive heat that seemed to be coming from his right, a stark and welcome contrast to the soul-deep cold that was his last memory. The second sensation was pain, a dull, throbbing ache in his side that flared into a sharp, fiery protest with every shallow breath he took. The third was the smell. Wood smoke, the earthy scent of drying herbs, and the faint, clean aroma of pine. He forced his heavy eyelids to open. The world swam into focus slowly, a collection of soft, blurry shapes. He was indoors. The ceiling above him was a rough-hewn lattice of pine branches, smoke-darkened and fragrant. He was lying on a pallet of soft furspicin and deer, by the feel of the mend was covered by a heavy wool blanket. To his right, a small, well-contained fire danced in a clay-lined pit, its flames the source of the welcome warmth. This was not a settler's cabin. It was a wickiup, the traditional dwelling of the Apache. It was simple, conical in shape, its framework of branches covered in hides and brush, yet it felt more solid and secure than any place he had been in a long time. He tried to sit up, but a bolt of agony shot through his side, and he fell back with a sharp, involuntary hiss of breath. The movement drew the attention of the wickiup's sole other occupant. The woman from the river rose from her place by the fire and moved towards him. She moved with a fluid, noiseless grace, her moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth floor. She was even more striking now than he had remembered. In the soft firelight, her features were less severe, but no less strong. Her dark hair was now dry, neatly braided, and tied with a simple leather thong. She wore a practical deerskin dress, worn but impeccably clean. She was not a girl, but a woman in the prime of her life, her face etched with a quiet wisdom and a sorrow that she wore not as a burden, but as a part of her own unyielding strength. She knelt beside him, her expression neutral, her dark eyes assessing him with a clinical detachment. "Be still," she said, her voice the same low, clear tone he remembered. "You have a fever, and the river did not wash you clean of your troubles." She gestured to his side. He looked down and saw that he was bare-chested. A thick poultice of crushed green leaves and mud was packed around a wound just below his ribs, held in place by a clean linen bandage. His own clothes, washed and mended, were folded neatly on a nearby rock. His gun belt, however, was nowhere in sight. A flicker of alarm shot through him. A man without his gun in these territories was a dead man. My gun, he rasped, his throat dry and raw. It is safe, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. As is the knife in your boot. You will have no need of them here. Here, you are not a gunman. You are a patient. She held a small clay cup to his lips. It was filled with a warm, bitter-tasting tea. Drink. It will help with the fever. He was in no position to argue. He drank, the bitter liquid warming him from the inside. He watched her as she tended to him, her movements efficient and sure. She checked the poultice, her touch surprisingly gentle despite the strength he knew she possessed. She placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, and the relief was immense. She did all of this without any hint of sentimentality. It was the work of a healer, the duty being performed. And yet, beneath her professional detachment, he sensed a deep, biting competence that was more reassuring than any empty words of comfort could ever be. Who, he began, but his voice failed him. I am Tala, she said, answering the unspoken question. It means stalking wolf. Caleb absorbed this. A wolf. It suited her. She had the same quiet, watchful intensity, the same self-contained power. Why? He managed to ask, the question that had haunted him since she'd pulled him from the water. Why did you save me? Tala paused in her work. She looked at him, and for the first time, her mask of neutrality slipped, revealing a flicker of the profound sorrow he had glimpsed in her eyes before. The river has taken enough from me, she said, her voice soft but laced with a core of steel. I would not let it have another. Not that day. She offered no further explanation. She turned and went back to the fire, leaving him to ponder her cryptic words. The river has taken enough from me. What did that mean? Who had she lost to the Gilla's cold embrace? For the next few days, Caleb drifted in and out of a feverish haze. His world shrank to the confines of the small wickiup. He was aware of the passage of time only by the shifting light that filtered through the smoke hole at the peak of the roof. Through it all, Tala was a constant, steady presence. She changed his bandages, forced him to drink her bitter teas and thin, nourishing broths, and sat by the fire through the long nights, keeping watch while he slept. She rarely spoke, and he was too weak to do much more than whisper. Their communication was one of gestures and necessity. A nod for more water. A grimace of pain as she cleaned his wound. A quiet, shared silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of the wind sighing through the pines outside. During his more lucid moments, he studied her. He watched as she tanned a hide with a scraper made of bone, her movements economical and powerful. He watched her mend his shirt with a needle fashioned from a turkey bone and thread made of sinew, her stitches small and perfect. He saw her leaving at dawn with a bow and a quiver of arrows, and returning at dusk with a rabbit or a brace of quail. She was completely self-sufficient, a queen in her small, wild kingdom. He also noticed the things that were missing. There were no other people. No sounds of children playing or men talking. The wickiup, though well kept, was sized for two, yet held the deep, profound silence of a place long accustomed to being occupied by only one. On a small, carved shelf, next to a collection of arrowheads, sat a single eagle feather, the kind a warrior would earn through a great act of courage. It was the only object in the dwelling that seemed purely decorative, purely sentimental. He suspected it had belonged to the one the river had taken. One afternoon, the fever finally broke. He woke up drenched in sweat, but his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The pain in his side had subsided to a dull, manageable ache. Tala was sitting by the entrance, sharpening the blade of a skinning knife on a smooth, flat stone. The rhythmic, scraping sound was oddly comforting. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. She must have seen the clarity in them, because she set her knife aside and came to him. She placed a hand on his forehead, her palm cool and dry. The fever is gone, she stated, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. The wolf has decided to live. Thanks to you, Caleb said, his voice stronger now. My name is Caleb. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Caleb, she repeated, tasting the name. It is a good name, but a name with much trouble following it. His caution returned in a rush. What makes you say that? Men with shotgun wounds, drifting down a river, do not find themselves in such a state by accident, she said simply. You were running from something. Now, you must heal. When you are strong, you will continue your run. But for now here, you will be still. And you will be safe. Her words were a promise and a command. He was her guest, her patient. But he was also, in a way, her prisoner. A prisoner of his own weakness and of her unexpected, inexplicable mercy. He looked around the small, warm wickiup, a sanctuary he had not sought, offered by a woman he did not know. He was safe, for now. But the world outside, and the men who hunted him, had not gone away. They were still out there, beyond the circle of firelight and the scent of pine. And sooner or later, they would come looking for him. The embers of his life had been coaxed back to a fragile flame, but a storm was gathering, and he knew he had brought its shadow to the doorstep of the woman who had saved him. The breaking of the fever marked a turning point. With his mind clear and the pain in his side receding to a constant, nagging ache, Caleb began to truly inhabit the world of the wickiup. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, healing rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaotic, violent tempo his life had taken on in recent months. The silence between him and Tala began to change. It was no longer just the silence of a healer and her patient, but a space that was gradually being filled with a cautious and spoken curiosity. Caleb grew stronger each day. At first, he could only sit up, his back braced against the curved wall of the wickiup. He would watch Tala as she went about her daily tasks, a silent observer of her self-reliant existence. He learned the cadence of her life, the pre-dawn check of her snares, the mid-morning gathering of roots and berries, the afternoon work of preparing hides or fletching arrows, the evening meal cooked over the glowing coals. She moved with a purpose and a grace that he found mesmerizing. She was a part of this wilderness, not just an inhabitant of it. The wind in the pines seemed to speak to her. The tracks in the mud told her stories he could not read. As his strength returned, he began to resent his own helplessness. He was a man of action, used to pulling his own weight. To be confined, cared for, and utterly dependent was a new and uncomfortable experience. One morning, as Tala prepared to leave for her morning hunt, he pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. "I can help," he said, his voice still a bit rough from disuse. Tala turned, her bow in hand, and looked him over with a critical eye. "You can help by not reopening your wound," she replied, her tone flat. "I can chop wood. I can fetch water," he insisted, taking a steadying step. "I can't just lie here like a sack of feed." She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes weighing his pride against his physical limits. Finally, she gave a slight nod. "There is a small axe by the woodpile. Do not wander far. The spring is just beyond the large spruce tree. Do not strain yourself. If you fall, I will not carry you back." Despite her blunt words, Caleb felt a small victory. It was a test. She was granting him a small measure of responsibility, a chance to prove he was more than just a burden. The work was harder than he expected. His body was weak, and his side protested every movement. But the simple, physical labor was cleansing. The clean scent of split pine, the cold shock of the spring water on his hands, the feeling of his muscles slowly remembering their strength, it was all a reaffirmation of his own life. When Tala returned with 2 squirrels, she found a neat stack of firewood and a full water skin waiting for her. She said nothing, but he saw a flicker of approval in her eyes before she turned away. That evening, as they sat by the fire roasting the squirrels, Caleb decided to breach the wall of her reserve. "You speak English well," he observed. Tala turned a piece of meat over the fire with a sharpened stick. "My father was a scout for the army. For a time," she said, her eyes on the flames. "He believed it was important to know the language of the men who were changing the world. He said it is hard to fight an enemy, but harder still to fight an enemy you cannot understand." "Is that what I am?" Caleb asked quietly. "An enemy?" She finally looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "You are a white man with a gun. Historically, that has not been a good combination for my people." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But you are also the man I pulled from the river. The spirits of that water have not yet decided what you are. And neither have I." It was the most she had ever said to him about her feelings, a stark and honest assessment of the gulf between them. "The men I was with," Caleb began, feeling a sudden need to explain, to separate himself from the likes of Marcus Flint. "I wasn't one of them." "Not really. You rode with them. You drew a gun with them," she countered simply. And I turned that gun on them when they went too far," he shot back, a flash of his old fire returning. "They killed a boy, a guard on a stagecoach. For nothing. Just for the pleasure of it." He looked down at his hands. "I had to do something." Tala was silent for a long time, studying his face in the flickering firelight. She was reading him, he realized, in the same way she read the tracks in the forest, looking for signs of truth or deception. "So, the trouble that follows you," she said at last. "It has a name." Marcus Flint and the Black Creek Raiders, Caleb confirmed, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "They won't stop until they find me. They can't afford to leave a witness, especially one who fought back." He had laid a piece of his past at her feet, a dangerous, bloody truth. He waited for her reaction, for fear, for judgment, for the demand that he leave. Instead, she just nodded slowly. "Every person carries the ghosts of those they have wronged," she said, her voice soft and heavy with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "And the ghosts of those who have wronged them." She looked towards the small shelf where the eagle feather sat, a silent testament to her own ghost. "The river," Caleb said gently, daring to step onto the sacred ground of her own past. "You said it had taken enough from you. Who was it?" Tala's hands, which had been deftly handling the cooking meat, stilled. Her gaze became distant, her eyes seeing a memory that was as clear and painful as if it had happened yesterday. "My husband," she said, her voice a low whisper that was almost lost to the crackle of the flames. "His name was Caleb. He was a great warrior, a great hunter. His heart was as strong as the mountain." A faint, sad smile touched her lips for a fleeting moment. "He did not die in battle with the Bluecoats. He did not die of sickness. He was killed by prospectors. White men, like you, who had found gold on our lands. They said he was trespassing. They shot him in the back as he was fishing in the river. The same river that tried to take you." She fell silent, her grief a palpable presence in the small wickiup. Caleb's own troubles, his flight from outlaw justice, suddenly felt small and selfish in the face of her profound, quiet sorrow. Her loss was not the result of a bad choice or a life of crime. It was an injustice, a wound carved into her life by the casual greed and cruelty of the changing world. "They murdered him," she continued, her voice regaining its core of steel, "and then the river washed him away before I could bring him home for a proper burial. So now he wanders, his spirit trapped between the land and the water. The river owes me a life." "Perhaps," she said, looking at Caleb with an intensity that pierced him to the core, "it has finally paid its debt." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, painful bridge of shared loss. He was a man running from his past, she was a woman chained to hers. He was a ghost being hunted, she was a ghost who was a hunter, forever stalking the banks of the river that held her husband's spirit. They were from two different worlds, two opposing sides of a brutal, ongoing war for the soul of the land itself. But here in this small, hidden shelter, surrounded by the vast, silent wilderness, they were just two people, bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything. The caution between them began to dissolve, replaced by the first, tentative shoots of a fragile trust. She had seen the truth of his past, and he had been allowed to witness the depths of her sorrow. That night, the silence by the fire was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts they both carried. And for the first time since he'd fled the Black Creek Raiders, Caleb didn't feel entirely alone. In the weeks that followed their shared confessions, the atmosphere in the wickiup transformed. The cautious distance between Caleb and Tala slowly eroded, replaced by a comfortable, functioning partnership. They were a study in contrasts who had found a surprising, unspoken rhythm. His raw, frontier strength complemented her quiet, earthbound wisdom. They were two solitary notes that, when played together, created a harmony that neither had expected. Caleb's wound healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar on his side that served as a permanent reminder of his break with his past. His strength returned fully, and with it, his desire to contribute. He took over the more physically demanding course, copying a formidable woodpile that would see them through a cold snap, reinforcing the wickiup structure with fresh mud and branches, and clearing a small patch of land for the wild herbs Tala cultivated. He worked with a grim determination, channeling his restless energy into tangible, useful tasks. It felt good to build something, however small, after a life of drifting and taking. Tala, in turn, began to treat him less like a patient and more like a student. She taught him the secrets of her world, the silent language of the forest. She showed him how to identify the tracks of a mountain lion versus those of a wolf, how to find north using the moss on the trees, and which mushrooms were a gift of sustenance and which were a promise of a swift, painful death. She taught him how to move through the woods without a sound, to place his feet with the same deliberate care she did, to become a shadow among shadows. For a man used to the open plains and dusty towns of the West, it was a rare-education. He learned that the wilderness he had always seen as an obstacle to be overcome was, in fact, a home, provider, and a sanctuary, if you knew how to listen to it. Their trust was not built on grand declarations, but on small, accumulated moments. It was in the way she began leaving the wickiup for longer periods, confident he could manage on his own. It was in the way he would have a fire going and water heated for her when she returned, cold and weary, from a long hunt. It was in the way she finally, one afternoon, returned his cold peacemaker and his gun belt, placing them on his fur pallet without a word. He looked from the gun to her, an unspoken question in his eyes. "A man should not be without his tools," she said simply, "but this is a place of peace. I trust you know when to use it, and when to let it sleep." He took the gun, the familiar weight of it in his hand both a comfort and a burden. He checked the action, cleaned the barrel, and then, instead of strapping it on, he wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth and put it away. It was his own silent promise to her. Their conversations grew more frequent, flowing more easily in the quiet evenings by the fire. He told her about the farm in Ohio he had run away from, seeking adventure and freedom, only to find hardship and bad company. He spoke of his dream to one day have a small piece of land of his own, a place where he could raise horses, a dream that now seemed impossibly distant. She, in turn, shared stories of her people, of their beliefs and their struggles. She spoke of the spirit world, of the power of the mountain and the river. She described the joy of the seasonal hunts and the sorrow of seeing her land shrink, her way of life threatened by the relentless tide of settlers and prospectors. She spoke of Kelu, not with the raw grief of their first conversation, but with a fond, loving sadness. She told Caleb of his bravery, his laughter, his skill as a hunter. In sharing her memories, she was not just mourning her husband, she was keeping him alive. And in listening, Caleb was not just a stranger, he was a keeper of those memories, a guardian of a story that would otherwise have been lost to the wind. One gray, overcast afternoon, the fragile piece of their existence was put to the test. A storm, which had been brewing in the mountains for days, finally broke with a sudden, violent fury. The wind howled through the canyon like a freight train, and the rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. The sky, which had been a dull gray, turned a bruised, angry purple, and the world was illuminated by jagged, terrifying flashes of lightning, followed by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Caleb and Tala were caught out in the open, gathering firewood a short distance from the wickiup. The storm descended upon them in a matter of minutes. "We must get back," Tala shouted over the roar of the wind. They ran heads down, against the driving rain. A bolt of lightning struck a massive, ancient pine tree not 50 yards from them. There was a sound like the sky itself tearing in two, and the tree exploded in a shower of sparks and splinters. The massive trunk, now a flaming torch, crashed to the ground directly in their path back to the shelter, blocking their way with a wall of fire and fallen branches. They were trapped, exposed to the full fury of the storm. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the cold, drenching rain was already beginning to chill them to the bone. "There is a place," Tala yelled, grabbing his arm, her grip as strong as it had been in the river. "An old bear den, in the rocks. This way." She led him not away from the cliffs, but towards them, to a place where a jumble of massive boulders formed a small, natural cave. It wasn't much, just a shallow overhang, barely deep enough to shelter them from the worst of the downpour, but it was better than nothing. They huddled together in the small space, their shoulders touching, the wind and rain lashing at the entrance. They were soaked through, and a dangerous chill was setting in. Caleb could see Tala shivering, though she tried to hide it. Without a fire, the cold could become a serious threat. "We need warmth," Caleb said, his own teeth beginning to chatter. He looked at her, then made a decision. He moved closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. It was a purely practical gesture, an attempt to share their dwindling body heat. But in that moment, it became something more. Tala stiffened for a second, surprised by the contact. But then, she relaxed, leaning into his warmth. In the cramped, cold darkness of the cave, with the storm raging around them, a new level of intimacy was forged. They were no longer just a healer and her patient, or a teacher and her student. They were two people, huddled together against the indifferent violence of the world, finding a small pocket of warmth and safety in each other's presence. He could feel the steady beat of her heart through her damp deerskin dress. He could smell the scent of rain and pine in her hair. She rested her head against his shoulder, and a comfortable silence fell between them, a silence that was more profound and more meaningful than any words could have been. The storm outside was a thing of chaos and destruction, but inside their small shelter, a fragile and spoken trust had finally blossomed into a quiet, powerful bond. They were no longer two separate survivors. They were unit, and they would face whatever came next, together. The storm raged through the night, a wild and tamed symphony of wind and water. Huddled in the cramped darkness of the bare den, Caleb and Tala weathered it together. The shared warmth of their bodies became a small, defiant flame against the encroaching cold, a silent testament to the bond that had grown between them. As the hours passed, the initial, practical necessity of their closeness gave way to a quiet, profound sense of intimacy. Caleb was acutely aware of the steady rhythm of Tala's breathing, the slight weight of her head on his shoulder. It was a simple, human connection, yet for a man who had lived as a solitary drifter for so long, it felt monumental. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a world washed clean. The rain had stopped, the wind had died down, and the rising sun painted the dripping forest in hues of gold and rose. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of wet earth and pine. It was a world reborn. They emerged from the cave, stiff and cold, but alive. The massive, smoldering trunk of the fallen pine still blocked their path. Without a word, they began to work together, he using his strength to heave the larger branches aside, she using her knife to cut away the smaller ones. They moved in a practiced, easy rhythm, a team that no longer needed words to communicate. By midday, they had cleared a path and returned to the wickiup. It had survived the storm, a small, resilient testament to Tala's skill in its construction. They spent the rest of the day in a comfortable domesticity, drying their clothes by the fire, repairing the minor damage to the shelter, and replenishing their food supplies. The shared ordeal of the storm had changed things. The last vestiges of caution and reserve had been washed away, leaving behind a deep and spoken understanding. That evening, as they shared a meal of roasted rabbit and roots, the mood was different. It was relaxed, peaceful. Caleb found himself wanting to fill the comfortable silence, to share the last, darkest corner of his past that he had kept hidden. He had told her about the Black Creek Raiders, but he had not told her why he had joined them in the first place. "You know," he began, his voice quiet, "I wasn't always just a drifter. Before I fell in with Flint's crew, I had a brother. His name was Samuel." Tala listened, her dark eyes attentive, giving him the space to tell his story. "He was younger than me, full of fire and big ideas. We left the farm together. We were going to make our fortune, maybe head out to California, buy a piece of land. But we were naive. We got taken in a card game in a dusty little town in Texas. Lost everything we had. We were desperate. That's when we met Marcus Flint." Caleb stared into the fire, the flames reflecting old, painful memories. "Flint. He has a way about him. He can make the ugliest plans sound like a grand adventure. He offered us a place in his gang, a way to get back on our feet." I was hesitant, but Samuel, he was dazzled. He saw it as a shortcut to our dream. I went along with it, mostly to look out for him. He paused, the next part of the story heavy in his throat. "It was a mistake. The work got uglier, the jobs more violent. I wanted out, but Samuel was in deep. He liked the money, the thrill. Then, out a bank job in a small Kansas town, it all went wrong. The sheriff was waiting for us. There was a gunfight. Samuel, he was shot. He died right there, in the street." A profound silence filled the wickiup. Caleb's scar on his side was a visible wound, but this, he realized, was his true and seen injury, the one that had never healed. Flint and the others, they just left him there, rode off without a backward glance. He was just a liability to them. I buried my own brother, and then I rode away. I drifted for a year after that, just trying to outrun his ghost. When I finally ran into Flint's crew again, I was empty. I rejoined them because I had nowhere else to go. I guess, in a way, I was looking for a way to die. Then came the stagecoach, and the boy they killed. It was like seeing Samuel die all over again. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't stand by and watch them do to another family what they had done to ours. He finally looked at Tala. Her expression was one of deep, compassionate understanding. She reached across the small space between them and placed her hand on his forearm. Her touch was warm and steady. "You carry a heavy burden, Caleb," she said softly. "The scar on your soul is deeper than the one on your side. But you did not let the darkness consume you. You fought back. You chose to honor your brother's memory, not by following the path that killed him, but by standing against it. That is the choice of a good man." Her words were a balm on a wound he had carried alone for years. The absolution he had never been able to grant himself, she gave to him freely. In that moment, something shifted in him. The affection he had begun to feel for her, an affection born of gratitude and respect, deepened into something more profound. He saw her not just as a strong, capable woman, but as a person of incredible empathy, a kindred spirit who understood the language of loss. He turned his arm and took her hand in his. Her skin was calloused from work, but her touch was gentle. They sat like that for a long moment, their hands clasped, the firelight dancing on their faces. The silence was no longer about shared ghosts or unspoken trust. It was about a present, living connection, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was Tala who finally broke the spell, though she did not pull her hand away. "You cannot outrun a ghost like Marcus Flint," she said, her voice filled with a new, protective intensity. "A man like that does not forgive. He does not forget. He will hunt you to the ends of the earth. You cannot keep running, Caleb. Sooner or later, you must turn and face the storm." He looked into her dark, serious eyes and knew that she was right. He had been running for so long, he had forgotten how to stand and fight for something. But now, sitting here in this small, peaceful shelter, holding the hand of the woman who had saved him in more ways than one, he felt a flicker of a feeling he had thought long dead: hope. He had something to protect. He had a reason to fight back. "I know," he said, his voice firm, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "But I'm not running anymore. Not alone." The unspoken promise in those words hung in the air, a declaration that was more powerful than any flowery vow. He was no longer just a man passing through. He was a man taking a stand. And he was choosing to take it here with her. Tala looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, the sorrow in her eyes was replaced by a warm, glowing ember of something he had never seen there before: hope. Their fragile sanctuary, however, was living on borrowed time. The world outside their hidden canyon had not ceased to turn, and the gears of vengeance and greed were grinding ever closer. The first sign of intrusion came a few days later. It was subtle, a thing only Tala would have noticed. She had gone out hunting at dawn, moving through the forest with her usual silent grace. When she returned late in the morning, an empty game bag in her hand, Caleb knew immediately that something was wrong. There was a new tension in her posture, a coiled stillness that he had not seen since the first days he had known her. "The forest is quiet," she said, her voice a low, concerned murmur as she placed her unstrung bow by the entrance. "Too quiet. The deer have moved to higher ground, and the birds are not singing. Something has spooked them. Something that does not belong here." Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had grown to trust Tala's instincts implicitly. She read the wilderness like a book, and the book was telling her that a predator had entered her territory. "What do you think it is?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving towards the oilcloth-wrapped bundle that held his Colt. "I do not know," she admitted, her eyes scanning the ridgeline visible through the trees. "A cougar, perhaps, or a bear, but my spirit feels uneasy. It feels like the shadow of a man." For 2 days, they lived in a state of heightened alert. They spoke in hushed tones, and every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Caleb unwrapped his gun and strapped on the worn leather belt, the weight of it once again a familiar, grim comfort. He felt a pang of guilt, as if he were contaminating her peaceful world with the violence of his own. But Tala did not object. She simply nodded, her expression grim, and took to carrying her own bow, strung and ready, with an arrow nocked. On the third morning, Tala found the proof they had been dreading. On a routine check of her snare lines near the river, she found a single, distinctive track in the mud, partially obscured but unmistakable. It was the print of a horseshoe, one that was slightly chipped on the left side. She returned to the wickiup, her face a mask of stone. "They are here," she said without preamble. "One rider, a scout. He crossed the river downstream this morning. The shoe on his horse is damaged." Caleb's blood ran cold. "I chipped horseshoe." He knew that shoe. It belonged to a man named Lefty Pete, one of Marcus Flint's most trusted trackers. He remembered the man boasting about how the chipped shoe gave his horse a distinctive gait. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, but now it was a death sentence. "He's one of Flint's," Caleb said, his voice hard. "An expert tracker. If he's here, the others are not far behind. He'll have found my trail from the riverbank by now." The sanctuary was breached. The shadow had a name, and it was his own past, come to haunt him and to destroy the first real peace he had ever known. "We have to leave," Caleb said immediately, his mind racing. "We can pack supplies, head deeper into the mountains. I can lead them away from here. They're hunting me, Tala, not you. I won't let them bring their fight to your home." Tala looked around the wickiup, at the furs on the floor, the herbs hanging from the ceiling, the small shelf with Kella's eagle feather. This was her home. The only home she had left. It was a place of memory, of solitude, of healing. It was her world. "No," she said, her voice filled with a quiet and yielding resolve that sent a shiver down his spine. "You said you were done running. I am done running too." She looked him in the eye, and he saw the stalking wolf of her namesake looking back at him. "My husband was killed on this land because he would not run from men like yours. This is my land. This is my home. If they bring their storm here, then we will be the rock that breaks it." Caleb was stunned into silence. He had expected her to be afraid, to want to flee the coming violence. Instead, she was choosing to stand with him, to fight for her home, for their shared sanctuary. Her courage was a thing of humbling, terrifying beauty. He had come into her life as a broken man, a piece of driftwood washed ashore. Now, she was offering to stand as his shield, his ally. "They will come," Caleb said, his voice low. "Flint won't send just one man. When the scout reports back, he'll bring all of them. There could be 10, maybe more. Then 10 will fall," Tala replied simply, as if stating a fact of nature. A plan began to form, a desperate strategy born of their combined knowledge. He knew the enemy, their tactics, their cruelty, their overconfidence. She knew the battlefield, every rock, every tree, every shadow of this canyon was a part of her. He was the gun, and she was the ghost. They spent the rest of the day preparing for war. They were no longer a healer and her patient. They were two warriors, sharpening their claws for the coming battle. Caleb cleaned his pistol and rifle until they gleamed, methodically counting out his precious supply of cartridges. Tala, meanwhile, worked with a silent, deadly focus. She treated a series of arrowheads with a dark, sticky substance from a small pouch of potent poison derived from rattlesnake venom and crushed herbs. She checked the tension on her bowstring. She filled several small pouches with sharp, pointed stones, to be thrown as a distraction. They worked together, moving with a shared, grim purpose. They set up defensive positions, using the natural cover of the rocks and trees around the wickiup. They planned lines of fire and escape routes. He was the soldier, thinking in terms of tactics and firepower. She was the hunter, thinking in terms of stealth, traps, and the use of the natural environment. As dusk fell, casting long, menacing shadows across the canyon, they finished their preparations. Everything was still. The forest was holding its breath, waiting. They sat together inside the wickiup, the fire unlit to avoid attracting attention, the darkness a thick, heavy blanket. The peace was gone, shattered by the approaching hoofbeats of Caleb's past. The shadow on the mountain was no longer a distant threat. It was descending upon them, and their small, fragile world was about to become a crucible of blood and fire. The night passed in a state of agonizing, suspended tension. Every rustle of a nocturnal animal, Every sigh of the wind sounded like the approach of an enemy. Caleb and Tala took turns on watch, a silent, 4-hour vigil for each, while the other rested with a light, fitful sleep. They were to coiled springs, wound to the breaking point, waiting for the inevitable snap. The attack did not come in the night. Marcus Flint was arrogant, and he enjoyed his theatrics. He wanted his victims to see their doom approaching in the clear light of day. He wanted Caleb to see his face, know the full extent of his failure to escape. They came just after dawn. The first sign was a single hawk's cry, and naturally sharp, echoing from the eastern ridgeline. It was a signal. Tala heard it and her body went rigid. "They are here," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the morning mist. Caleb peered through a carefully prepared slit in the Wickiup's hide covering. He saw them, moving through the trees like wraiths. There were 9 of them, dismounted, fanning out to form a semicircle around the small clearing. They were professionals, moving with a practiced, predatory silence. And leading them, stepping into the clearing with a confident, swaggering gait, was Marcus Flint himself. Flint was a tall, handsome man in a cruel, sharp-featured way. He wore a fine, tailored coat and carried a silver-inlaid revolver on his hip. He looked more like a riverboat gambler than a common outlaw, but his eyes, the color of a frozen lake, held a capacity for violence that was chilling. He stopped in the center of the clearing, his cold gaze fixed on the Wickiup. "Caleb," Flint's voice was smooth, cultured, but it carried an edge of pure menace. "I know you're in there. I have to admit, I'm impressed. You led us on quite a chase. But the trail always ends, my friend. Always." Caleb remained silent, his rifle pressed to his shoulder, the sight trained on Flint's chest. It was a tempting shot, but he knew the moment he fired, the others would open up. Flint chuckled, a low and pleasant sound. "Hiding, are we? And with company, I see. My scout tells me you've taken up with a little Apache squaw. TSK, Caleb. I thought you had better taste." His eyes roamed the clearing, a look of contemptuous ownership on his face. "This is a cozy little spot. After we're done with you, I think we might just stay a while." The threat, aimed squarely at Tala and her home, sent a surge of pure, white-hot rage through Caleb. His finger tightened on the trigger. Beside him, Tala placed a calming hand on his arm. "Not yet," she breathed. "Let him get closer." "Come on out, Caleb," Flint called, his patience wearing thin. "Face me like a man. Or do I have to burn you out? I have to admit, I do so love the smell of a fire." He drew his silver revolver with a theatrical flourish. "Last chance." That was the signal. As one, the 8 raiders surrounding the clearing raised their rifles. The siege was about to begin. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had focused all their attention on the Wickiup, the obvious source of the threat. They had not accounted for the fact that their enemy was not 1 person, but 2. And one of them was not in the shelter. Just as Flint's men leveled their guns, a silent, deadly projectile arced from the dense canopy of a large spruce tree to the west of the clearing. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers and tipped with poison, buried itself in the throat of a raider taking cover behind a large rock. The man made a gurgling, strangled sound, his rifle discharging into the dirt as he clawed at his neck, his eyes wide with shocked agony. He collapsed, convulsing, and was dead within seconds. The raiders, startled, spun around, firing wildly towards the spruce tree. At that exact moment, Caleb fired his rifle. The shot was deafening in the morning quiet. The bullet struck another raider, standing in the open, squarely in the chest, throwing him backwards into the brush. 2 men down in the span of 3 seconds. The element of surprise was total. Flint, his face a mask of fury, dove for cover behind a fallen log, screaming orders. "She's in the trees. Pin her down. You 3, rush the hut. Now." 3 men, emboldened by their leader's command, broke from the tree line and charged towards the Wickiup, firing their pistols as they ran. This was the moment Caleb had been waiting for. He switched from his single-shot rifle to his 6-shot Colt Peacemaker. He fired with a calm, deadly precision that Tala's patient teaching had helped him hone. The first man went down with a shot to the leg, his charge ending in a screaming, tumbling fall. The second man staggered and fell as a bullet took him in the gut. The third raider, a big, bearded man, almost made it. He reached the entrance of the Wickiup, a triumphant snarl on his face. But he had forgotten about the second person who was supposed to be inside. As he lunged through the hide flap, Tala, who had silently circled back to the Wickiup's rear entrance while the others were distracted, drove the butt of her heavy skinning knife into his temple. The man grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed in a heap. The initial, furious assault was broken. 5 men were down. Flint and the 3 remaining raiders were pinned behind cover, momentarily stunned by the ferocity and efficiency of the defense. They had expected to corner a single, desperate fugitive. Instead, they had stumbled into a meticulously prepared killing ground, defended by a crack-shot gunman and a silent, deadly forest spirit. "Damn you, Caleb!" Flint screamed from behind his log, his voice laced with a fury that bordered on madness. "Damn you to hell!" The clearing fell into a tense, temporary silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded raider. The sanctuary had held, but Caleb and Tala knew this was only the beginning. Flint was not a man who accepted defeat. He was trapped, enraged, and his cruelty would only escalate. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the small, isolated clearing, and the siege of their sanctuary settled in for a long, bloody battle of wills. The sun beat down on the clearing, turning the small battlefield into a sweltering oven. A tense stalemate descended. Flint and his 3 remaining men were pinned down, and willing to risk another charge against the deadly accuracy of Caleb's pistol and the unseen threat of Tala's arrows. Caleb, in turn, was trapped in the Wickiup, knowing that to expose himself for more than a second would be to invite a volley of rifle fire. The hours crawled by. The only sounds were the buzz of flies gathering on the dead, the pain moans of the man Caleb had shot in the leg, and Flint's occasional, venomous curses. They were engaged in a war of attrition, a test of nerves and supplies. Caleb and Tala had water and some dried meat, but their ammunition was finite. Flint's men had the numbers, but their morale was clearly shaken. "You can't stay in there forever, Caleb," Flint shouted in the late afternoon, his voice hoarse. "When it gets dark, we're coming in. We're going to burn that little home of yours to the ground with you and your witch inside it." It was the threat Caleb had been expecting. Under the cover of darkness, their superior numbers would be a decisive advantage. They could approach from all sides, and a fire would turn the Wickiup into a death trap. As the sun began to dip towards the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery colors, Tala turned to Caleb. Her face was grim in the dimming light, her eyes holding a glint of hard, predatory resolve. "He thinks the darkness is his ally," she whispered. "He is wrong. The night belongs to me." A new plan was formed, a desperate, audacious gamble that would reverse their roles from the hunted to the hunters. They would not wait for the attack. They would take the fight to the enemy. Under the last vestiges of twilight, they made their move. Using a small, concealed escape slit Tala had cut in the back of the Wickiup, they slipped out into the deep shadows at the edge of the forest. They left a single, lit tallow lamp inside the shelter, its faint glow creating the illusion that it was still occupied. They separated, melting into the woods like smoke. Caleb, his boots wrapped in scraps of hide to muffle his steps, circled south. His job was to create a diversion, to draw their fire and attention. Tala, stripped down to her deerskin tunic, her face streaked with mud and charcoal, moved north. She was no longer Tala, the healer. She was Kelu's wife. She was the stalking wolf. She was a ghost in the night, an avenging spirit on her own sacred land. The forest, which had been a place of peace, was now her weapon. She moved through the undergrowth with a silence that was absolute, her feet unerringly finding the soft moss and avoiding the dried, noisy leaves. She knew every tree, every rock, every shadow. The raiders, city men used to dusty streets and noisy saloons, were blind and deaf in her world. Caleb reached his position, a rocky outcrop overlooking the raiders' camp from the side. He took a deep breath and opened fire, not aiming to kill, but to harass, to create chaos. He fired 2 quick shots into the trees just above Flint's position. "He's over there," one of the men yelled, and they immediately returned fire, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness, their bullets ricocheting wildly off the rocks near Caleb. The diversion was working. All their attention was now focused on him. While the forest was filled with the roar of gunfire, Tala closed in on her first target. A raider was crouched behind a tree, firing towards Caleb, his back completely exposed. Tala rose from the shadows behind him like a phantom. He never heard her. She brought the heavy stone head of her war club down in a single, swift, silent arc. The men collapsed without a sound. One left. She circled around the clearing, a patient, deadly predator. The second raider was reloading his rifle, nervously glancing into the darkness. He sensed something, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. He turned, his eyes wide. He saw nothing but shadows. When he turned back, Tala was there. Her knife flashed once in the moonlight, a quick, efficient strike. The man gurgled, clutching his throat, and fell to left. The third man, hearing his companion fall, panicked. He stood up and began firing blindly into the forest. "Where are you, you bastards?" he screamed, his voice high with terror. From her hiding place in the trees, Tala drew her bow. She did not use one of her poisoned arrows. This was a different kind of justice. The arrow flew true, burying itself deep in the man's shoulder. He screamed in pain and surprise, dropping his rifle. He was out of the fight. Only Flint remained. During the chaos, Flint had realized the Wickiup was a decoy. Cursing his own stupidity, he had abandoned his position and was making his way towards the horses, intent on escaping this nightmare. Caleb saw him moving and left his own cover, tracking him through the trees. The final confrontation took place in a small, moonlit glade where the raiders had tied their horses. Flint was fumbling with the reins of his mount when Caleb stepped out from behind a tree, his Colt peacemaker leveled. "It's over, Marcus," Caleb said, his voice cold and steady. Flint spun around, his silver revolver coming up. "Never," he snarled, his handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of hate. "You should have stayed dead, Caleb. You and that brother of yours." He fired. Caleb fired at the same time. The two gunshots echoed as one. Flint's bullet tore through the sleeve of Caleb's shirt, grazing his arm. Caleb's shot was true. It struck Flint in the chest, just over the heart. Flint staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his fine coat, then back up at Caleb. "Samuel," he gasped, as if seeing a ghost. Then his eyes went vacant, and he crumpled to the forest floor. Silence descended. A profound, absolute quiet. It was over. The siege was broken. The ghosts of Caleb's past had been faced, and they had been vanquished. He stood over the body of his former friend, his gun smoking in the moonlight, the sounds of the night slowly returning. He felt no triumph, only a vast, hollow emptiness. Tala emerged from the shadows, her knife in her hand, her face a grim, unreadable mask. She looked at the bodies, at Caleb, at the blood on his arm. She walked to him and gently took his arm, inspecting the wound. It was a shallow graze, nothing more. Their eyes met over the body of their fallen enemy. They had done it. They had stood together, and they had won. Their sanctuary was safe, but it was no longer a place of pristine peace. It had been consecrated with blood. They were both survivors, but the battle had left its own indelible scars on them, and on the home they had fought so hard to protect. The first light of dawn crept over the mountains, filtering through the trees to illuminate a scene of grim, silent aftermath. The battle was over, but the echoes of its violence remained. The bodies of the raiders lay where they had fallen, stark and still in the cool morning air. The scent of gunpowder still hung faintly in the clearing, the sharp, metallic tang that overlay the familiar smells of pine and damp earth. Their sanctuary had been defended, but it had been irrevocably tainted by the bloodshed. Caleb and Tala moved through the quiet clearing like two ghosts. There was no sense of victory, only a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion and the heavy weight of what they had been forced to do. They were bound not only by the trust they had built, but by the violence they had shared. Their first task was to tend to the living. The raider Tala had wounded with the arrow was still alive, semi-conscious and moaning in pain. Caleb stood over him, his expression hard, his pistol in his hand. Every instinct told him to finish it, to eliminate the last vestige of the threat. But then he looked at Tala. She was already gathering herbs and clean cloth. "We are not them, Caleb," she said softly, her voice firm. "We do not kill a man who cannot fight back." Her words cut through his anger, grounding him. She was right. To kill the wounded man would be to embrace the same casual cruelty that had defined Marcus Flint. They patched the man's shoulder as best they could, gave him a water skin, and pointed him in the direction of the nearest town, a 2-day walk away. "Tell them what happened here," Caleb said to the dazed man. "Tell them to send a marshal, or a priest, and tell any others who think of following Flint's path that this land is protected." The man stumbled away, a living message to the outside world. The rest of the day was spent on the grim, necessary task of burying the dead. They dragged the bodies, including Flint's, to a deep ravine far from the Wickiup and covered them with rocks and earth. It was hard, grim work, a final, somber ritual to close a bloody chapter of their lives. Caleb said no words over Flint's makeshift grave. He had nothing left to say. He was simply closing a door on his past, burying the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. When they were finished, they returned to the clearing. It was clean now, the bodies gone, but the psychic stain remained. The ground was scuffed from the fight, and a few stray bullet holes scarred the trees. The Wickiup, their home, felt different. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress, a place that had been defended at great cost. They sat by the fire that evening, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. The immediate threat was gone. Caleb's past had been confronted and defeated. He was, for the first time in years, a free man. Free from the hunt, free from the guilt of his brother's death, free from the shadow of Marcus Flint. But what did that freedom mean? He looked across the fire at Tala. Her face was weary, the lines of strain visible around her eyes. He had brought this storm to her doorstep. He had turned her peaceful home into a battlefield. He was a lightning rod for trouble, a man whose past was written in violence. Now that his past was dealt with, the logical, honorable thing to do was to leave, to take his trouble with him and let her return to her peaceful solitude. The thought of leaving, however, felt like tearing a part of himself away. "I should go," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Flint is gone, but men like him have long memories. There will be questions. Maybe a bounty. I can't bring that kind of trouble here again. You saved my life, Tala. You deserve to have your peace back." Tala was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. She had been thinking the same thing. Her life before Caleb had been quiet, solitary, ordered. It was a life of grieving, but it was a life she understood. He had brought chaos, danger, and a whirlwind of emotions she had thought long buried with Caleb. With him gone, the silence would return. The solitude would be absolute once more. The thought of that silence, which had once been a comfort, now felt like a vast, unbearable emptiness. "This land was not peaceful before you came, Caleb," she said at last, her voice low and steady. "My husband was murdered here. My people were driven from these mountains. The world of men like Flint has been trying to take this place for a long time. The only difference is yesterday, for the first time, this land fought back and won." She lifted her eyes to meet his, and the intensity in her gaze held him captive. "You say you brought your storm to me, but you also helped me stand against it. You helped me defend the memory of Caleb. You helped me defend my home. My peace," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips, "is no longer found in solitude. It is found in having someone to stand with." Her words were a revelation, a gift. She wasn't pushing him away. She was inviting him to stay. She was telling him that he was not a source of trouble, but a source of strength. That he was not a contaminant in her world, but a part of it now. He was faced with the most important choice of his life. Behind him lay the open trail, the drifter's freedom he had once craved, a life of lonely, meaningless wandering. Before him sat a woman of incredible strength and compassion, offering a chance at something he had never thought possible, a home, a future, a partner. It was a choice between the freedom of being alone and the freedom of having someone to belong to. Caleb looked at Tala, the firelight flickering in her dark, honest eyes, and he saw his future. The open trail, which had once represented freedom, now seemed like a barren, lonely road to nowhere. The freedom he had been chasing was an illusion, a boy's fantasy of a life without consequence or connection. True freedom, he was beginning to understand, was not about running away from things, but about having something worth standing your ground for. "When I was in that river," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was letting go. I was ready for it all to be over. I had nothing and no one. My past was a nightmare, and my future was a blank page. Then you pulled me out." He reached across the fire, and she met him halfway, their hands clasping in the warm air between them. Her grip was strong, steady. You did more than just save me from drowning, Tala, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You saved me from myself. You gave me a place to heal. You taught me to see the world in a new way. You showed me what it means to be strong, to be brave. You gave me a reason to fight, a reason to live. He looked around the clearing, at the familiar shapes of the trees against the star-dusted sky, at the small, resilient wickiup that had become his home. I don't want the open trail anymore, he said, his gaze returning to hers, his heart in his eyes. All I want is the trail that leads back here, to you. If you'll have me. A slow, beautiful smile spread across Tala's face, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her strong features and lit up her eyes from within. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. This was Kelu's home, she said softly, her thumb gently stroking the back of his hand. For a long time, I was just a ghost here, watching over his memories. But you are not a ghost, Caleb. You are a living man. And this is not a grave. It is a home. Our home. The word "our" sealed the promise. It was an acceptance, a beginning. The quiet after the storm was not an ending, but a new, more profound peace. In the days that followed, they began to rebuild. They repaired the bullet holes in the wickiup's hide covering. Caleb, using the axe, felled a few small trees and began constructing a more permanent, solid wall on the north side of the shelter, a barrier against the winter winds. Tala planted a small garden in the clearing, a splash of green, new life in the scarred earth. They were not just repairing what had been damaged, they were adding to it, improving it, weaving their lives together in the very structure of their home. One afternoon, they walked down to the river, the place where their story had begun. The Gila flowed peacefully now, its springtime rage a distant memory, its waters clear and sparkling in the sun. It no longer looked like a beast to Caleb. It looked like a place of baptism, of rebirth. Tala knelt at the water's edge and placed a single, perfect hawk's feather on the surface. For Caleb, she whispered, watching as the current gently took it and carried it downstream. Go in peace. Your home is protected. It was a letting go, a release of the ghosts she had clung to for so long. She then stood and took Caleb's hand. And for us, she said, looking at him, her eyes clear and full of a quiet, powerful love. They stood together on the riverbank, two survivors from two different worlds, their pasts scarred by violence and loss. The trail ahead of them was unknown. The world outside their small canyon was still a dangerous and changing place. There would be other storms, other challenges, but they would face them together. The lonely, hunted cowboy and the strong, mysterious Apache widow were no longer alone. Their paths had converged in the churning waters of the Gila, and now they would walk a single trail forward. Hand in hand, they turned their backs to the river and walked towards their home, their faces to the sun, ready to begin the unwritten next chapter of their lives. A new and hopeful tale in the heart of the Wild West.